2 weeks ago I was in Jerusalem for Shabbat, and we went to a Hashkama egalitarian minyan, which means an early morning Shabbat service in an egal place called Minyan Hakel in Baka, a neighborhood of Jerusalem. And it started at 7:30. We got there at 7:43, and they were already on the Amidah. And they don't miss a single thing. They do the whole Torah reading, the whole half Torah reading. They do a full repetition of the Amidah for both Shacharit and Musaf. No Devar Torah, no singing, but they finish at 10 to 9 and have Kiddush. So I promise you'd have all hated it. And so any more complaints about us running late? Forgive me. I want to ask if anyone can name their, in quotes, favorite villain from superhero movies. Call out some villains, some well-known villains. Lex Luthor, okay? Who? Who? Oh, right, okay. The Joker. I watched the second Joker film with Lady Gaga on the plane. Wow, it's dark. The one with Lady Gaga, yeah. Huh?
I thought you sat with Lady Gaga.
She was sitting next to her. She falls in love with the Joker in the film. It's quite an interesting story. Huh? It's all the previews talk about it. What other villains are there? Darth Vader, Voldemort.
If you want to complicate one, bag.
We have Voldemort. What did you say, Cecile?
Catwoman.
Catwoman.
I have one.
Yeah.
Trump from The Apprentice.
I'm looking at fiction. Yeah, Micah. Oh, okay. So now let's go a little deeper and just think about, and we don't know in all cases, but in most of those villains that have been mentioned, there's an origin story, right? There's an origin story that usually involves some kind of childhood trauma, some kind of awful relationship with, their father was killed by someone else, or whatever it might be. Even Voldemort has like a horrible origin backstory, right? I think certainly the Joker does. The way the Joker film with Joaquin Phoenix has been portrayed. I mean, if you've seen either of the Joker films in the recent years, I mean, just this awful childhood where he's not seen or respected or understood, and all he wants to do is make people laugh and entertain them, and then it just becomes this like horrible thing where he ends up being a violent criminal. And none of it justifies the violent crimes. But I think there is something that's really important about looking at some of these backstories. So in this week, where we're talking about Shabbat Zachor, and we read both in the Torah and in the Haftorah about this nation of Amalek, I think it's important to look at the backstory. And the backstory, we don't have to look that far if we want to delve into rabbinic literature. Because Amalek's grandfather, the father of Eliphaz, his father was Esau, right? And his mother was Timnah, who was actually a royal princess, and according to the Midrash, which is a rabbinic fantasy in this case, she desperately wanted to convert to Judaism. And she went, according to the Midrash, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and said, please convert me to Judaism. And she was rejected. They said, no, it's not appropriate to convert you to Judaism. And she was Amalek's mother. So you can sort of imagine, and many of the stories do imagine, you can imagine that Eliphaz, and maybe Esav was still alive, and maybe Amalek was a little child, and Esau, we remember, had his blessing and birthright stolen from him by Jacob, right? And in the story that we read in the Torah, Esav and Yaakov have this reconciliation and make peace. And so you can imagine, as some of the rabbis do, Esav sitting down with his grandson, little baby Amalek, and saying, you know, I couldn't get any revenge, but you can. Chilling to think about it, but maybe that's kind of what happened in some way. And then his mother, Timnah, was rejected. Many of us know the feeling of being rejected. And unfortunately, the Jewish world often makes people feel rejected and unwelcome and unseen. And so she carried that baggage. And if you imagine having a grandfather as Esav and a mother of Timnah, how does that impact who you become? So Amalek, as the real person, if he was a real person, carries this baggage that makes him intent on utter revenge and violent revenge. And the story of Amalek that we read twice in the Torah is that he attacks from behind. When everyone is weak and tired and defenseless, that's when he gets in. It's this unprovoked, horrible evil, right? And nothing justifies the evil of the attack. But I think it's important, if we want to be compassionate human beings, to understand some of the psychology that might make a monster, that might make a villain, that might make a demon, that might create evil. So we come to the nation of Amalek, right? And as I wrote about yesterday, the Talmud is very, very clear that the nation of Amalek as a nation doesn't exist anymore. The Sanherib, the Assyrian king, forcefully moved everybody from their land. They mixed up in different places. And there are these 7 nations plus Amalek that are mentioned in the Torah and over again as nations that we're supposed to eradicate. They don't exist anymore, according to the rabbis. So we can't actually attribute Amalek to any particular nation. That's according to the rabbis. So it comes to the complexity of our day and what Shabbat Zachor is really about. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you when you were weak and tired on your journey, right? Remember what Amalek did to you. Of course, many of us think of October 7th and the brutal, horrible ways in which people were taken from their beds and taken from the Nova Music Festival, and innocent people, non-combatants, taken and killed and attacked and raped, and all of the things that happened on October 7th. And there's something about that atrocity of October 7th that is definitely has the energy of Amalek, for sure. And of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust, has the energy of Amalek, the evil ideology of Nazism that wanted to eradicate the Jewish people. Energetically, it's all related to Amalek. But if we take seriously what the rabbis of the Talmud are telling us, we can't ascribe it to a whole nation. So we can't say that all Palestinians are Amalek. We can't say that all people who live in Gaza are Amalek. We can't say that our enemies throughout history, in their entirety, are Amalek. And yet there's a tendency to want to do that. And the tendency is understandable because it comes from legitimate rage, but it's also very dangerous. And so while we think about Amalek on Shabbat Zachor, and we do remember throughout history the awful things that have happened to the Jewish people, and you know, we have many times throughout our story where we remember that. I was just asked to write a commentary for a new Haggadah that's coming out on V'hi she'amda lavotenu, right? That passage of the Haggadah that says, in every generation we've had enemies who've risen up, who wanted to destroy us, right? And we have, and that's our reality. And of course that's connected to Amalek. But what do we do with it? Of course we have to be honest about our history and honest about who our enemies are. And we have to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. But some of what happens among the Jewish people, some of what happens in Israel, in my view, goes way too far. I don't think we can stand by and watch some of the settler violence and see some of the ways in which every time there is an attack on innocent civilians, admittedly, that there is this, in the same way that Amalek may have been driven by this passion to wipe out the whole people, and it's no doubt that Hamas are driven to wipe out the whole Jewish people. But if we, in our anger and rage, want to wipe out and displace and alienate and humiliate all of the Palestinian people, we become like Amalek. And that's what some of the Hasidic commentators warn us against. It's hard, but I think if we're talking about Shabbat Zachor, we have to look at it in all of its complexity and darkness. And there are ways in which we're still reeling, of course, from October 7th. There are ways in which we are thinking, as I already mentioned, the 59 hostages still in Gaza. And yet we also have to look at what it really means. What it really means to remember Amalek. The Hasidic commentator that reads Zachor et asher asa lacha Amalek, remember what Amalek did to you, actually rereads it as remember that you have become Amalek. And this notion that each of us has the capacity to be like Amalek. Each of us has the capacity to get so into our sense of hatred and vengefulness and revenge that we become Amalek. And so there's this sort of dual warning that the Torah is presenting to us. On the one hand, yes, of course we have to be honest and remember our history and remember the violence that's been perpetrated against us and remember the people who throughout history and still today want to wipe us out and want to see us obliterated. But we have to also take responsibility for the ways in which we have the capacity to become like Amalek and to recognize that it's really complicated and it's really dark. And as I said in what I wrote yesterday, I don't claim to have the answers or to have some kind of capacity to have access to a moral truth that others don't have. I don't. I know we're diverse, we have different opinions. Some of us probably do want to assign the whole of Hamas to Amalek and to finish the job and to completely obliterate the capacity that they have. And others of us don't think that's a reality. How do you do that in the way that it's being done? And I didn't really want to get into the realpolitik of it because it's divisive and it's complicated and we have different opinions among us. But I think it's important to at least recognize that we have different opinions among us. The Jewish people are not a monolith on this. The fact that I had many people on the listserv, many liberal rabbis who wanted to cancel Shabbat Zachor and not read this Haftorah, not read that Maftir, and say we can't read it in this time because it's too painful to think about the ways in which we have enacted revenge and enacted collateral damage on so many people. And it's hard also when we read the Megillah next week, which also has a whole cycle of revenge killings where thousands and thousands of people are killed and many of them are innocents. What makes Amalek Amalek, and frankly what makes Hamas Hamas, is the willful way in which non-combatants are attacked, because that is actually a violation of any principles of war. It's not been a symmetrical war in that sense. And some people will disagree with my view that the IDF constantly tries to avoid non-combatant casualties, but that's a whole other subject. But I think that there are ways in which we also have to recognize there were Times of Israel, which is one of my main sources for information, reported two horrible reports that came up about some revenge violence that happens in some parts of the IDF. And I don't think we can ignore this stuff. We can't ignore what goes on in our world. And at the same time, the balance of having to be responsible and keep ourselves safe at this terrible time. So, and it's so weird always that this is what we read right before Purim. And Purim is, Misha Nisasada Marvin Basimcha, like we're getting ready for this, crazy upside down celebration. And what is it that we celebrate on Purim? We celebrate this idea of being adda lo yada, of being in a state of consciousness when we no longer really know the difference. As the Talmud says, Hevdel ben Baruch Mordechai va'arur Haman. We don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Thank you. To get to that kind of non-dual state. The world feels so divisive right now. It feels so frightening how we're just pitted against each other in this world. And it's like, can you imagine a holiday that is trying to get us into this non-dual state where for 25 hours we get into this state of non-duality where we imagine that we don't actually know. We're not morally pure to really know the difference between good and evil in this world. And perhaps we can even look, just as I explained some of the biography of Amalek and of our villains, that maybe people who are sought to destroy us have, even though we ascribe them as being utterly evil, have some source of humanity that's broken and hurt and despairing, that they've been pushed away and been rejected, that they've been abused by relatives, that there's this ancestral trauma that we have collectively. And if there's a way that we can not become Amalek inside our own hearts, and that we can maintain the capacity to be compassionate, even when we feel full of rage and pain and fear and all the things that we do, so many of us feel. I think that's the very, very challenging invitation of Shabbat Zachor and the challenging invitation of Purim. If you look at the gematria, the Hebrew numerology of the word Amalek, Ayin, Mem, Lamed, Kuf, it adds up to quick. Anyone quick with math? 200 and what? 240 did I hear? Huh?
No, higher.
Work it out. Ayin is 70, Mem is 40, Lamed is 30, Kuf is 100. What's that adds up to? 240? 240. So now, another important word, Safek, Samech, Pei, Kuf. Samech is 60, Pei is 80, Kuf is 100, equals 240. So Safek means doubt. And so there is this Hasidic idea that there is something about doubt that is connected to the energy of Amalek too. So it's a complicated additional factor to this. Like on the one hand, there is this way in which we have to look at the Amalek inside of us. We have to look at the Amalek outside of us as our real external enemies. And we have to also see the ways in which doubt cripples us. And our doubt that we can do what we need to do in this world. Our doubt that there is no hope. Our doubt that we give in to despair. Our doubt that it's all over for us. All of the ways in which we allow our doubt to creep into our lives. That is also Amalek. Right? So it's a whole complex scene, this Amalek business. So to recap, the actual real Amalek may have been deeply traumatized by his ancestral lineage, by his grandfather and by his mother being rejected and his grandfather being cheated. That Amalek is a real source of external hatred that wants to destroy us in all of our ways, and that Amalek is also a force inside us, and that Amalek is also a kind of doubt that says we can't do this anymore. We can do it. We're going to get through it. We're going to survive. And the hostages are going to be freed. And there is a future that is possible beyond what we can really imagine. But what we can do, I think, is just look at ourselves. I don't think I have, and I hope most of you don't have the hubris, that however much there are people here who are fantastic activists and advocates in all kinds of ways. And that's important, and we should never stop that. But all we can really have control over, ultimately, is what we carry in our own hearts. and that we each have the capacity to be like Amalek. And if we can soften our own hearts and not have that cruel notion of revenge even when we're feeling vengeful and angry, and that we can be the best version of ourselves that we can be, then perhaps humanity has a chance. Misha, 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 I'm aware that some of you may be feeling really uncomfortable with some of what I've said, and that's okay. And I'd love to talk about it, and I'd love to find ways that we can actually have real conversations with each other about it, because we can't assume that everybody in this community has the same ideas and opinions about what's going on and what is going to go on in the future. So, Shabbat Shalom!